Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Stanza study. Today we'll be exploring different poetic techniques and structures. There are many more techniques to discuss beyond metaphors and similes, so I'm here to break them all down for you. Some of these techniques you might remember from primary or secondary school, but there's so much more you have to learn about them, which is why I'm here today. And trust me, I plan to do a better job than those little plastic sheets on the classroom walls do. To start off, let's look at sound devices. I'm sure you've heard of alliteration. This is when two or more words close together start with the same letter. An example of this is in Seamus Heaney's poem Storm on the Island, in the line "Space is a salvo," which uses two S's. When the letter S is repeated in alliteration, this is called sibilant and mimics the sound of water rushing, which is a recurring theme in Storm on the Island. Rougher sounding letters such as B, E, or P are called plosives and are used to mimic a heartbeat, which can generate a fear of chaos, fear, or anger. Consonance has a similar effect as alliteration, but instead of just the beginning of the letter being the same, different syllables throughout the word may sound similar. An example of this is this famous tongue twister, "She sells seashells on the seashore." The words "sea" and "she" repeat the S sound and the E sound to make the tongue twister sound a lot smoother. Assonance is when you use similar sounds within close proximity. An example of this is in Edgar Allan Poe's poem Bells, in the line "Hear the mellow wedding bells," which uses the vowel sound E close together. The words don't have to rhyme, but when they're used close together and they sound the same, it creates an almost lyrical flow towards the poem or piece of literature. Onomatopoeia is a technique you've probably heard of before. It mimics sound effects which can make a scene come to life. Think of comic books which have the words bang, crash, or boom in big letters and colourful speech bubbles. Words like these, especially in poetry, allow the readers to envision a scene from a story involving a lot of action, which helps a poem come to life like a story, like we discussed in my last video. Now, let's look at some structural techniques. Enjambment is when a lack of punctuation in a stanza affects the pace it's read or recited. It's basically continuing lines in a stanza without a pause to create an uninterrupted flow. Usually in poems, the lines would end with a full stop, comma, or semicolon, but with enjambment, you immediately read the following line without pausing. This is used to keep the reader immersed in the action of the story or event being described in the poem. On the other hand, caesura is the technique used for placing punctuation in the middle of a line. Unlike enjambment, this creates a suspenseful feel in the poem by constantly breaking a sentence down and is used in a much more slower-paced event. An example of this is in Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, which appears throughout the poem. "That will be damned for it. Would I know the villain?" The mood of this poem is calm yet brooding, so the sentences have a slow pace to reflect those tones. Recognize this technique? It's the name of my series. A stanza is essentially just a paragraph of a poem. Like paragraphs in novels, larger stanzas are slow and to create the pace of a more descriptive flow, whereas shorter stanzas, often referred to as couplets, present a sharp or abrupt effect. Some poems are just one long stanza, like Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias. Here, the entire poem is just one continuous description, so there's no need for stanza breaks. Now, I'm sure you must have heard of metaphors. A metaphor is when you say something is like something without it being literally true. For example, in William Blake's London, one of the lines says, "Runs in blood down palace walls." In this case, blood isn't actually running down the walls, but it refers to the carelessness of the wealthy living in luxury, while the poor suffer and eventually perish due to the harsh conditions of the time. Describing blood as running or dripping symbolizes guilt or ignorance. In this case, it indicates the upper class refusing to acknowledge the suffering of the working class. Likewise, similes compare things by using like or as another thing, instead of saying it is something else. In Ted Hughes' bayonet charge, he writes, "He lugged a rifle numb as a smashed arm." Unlike the case if you were to use a metaphor, Hughes isn't saying the soldier's arm is actually smashed, but it's so numb that it feels like it is. This gives the reader a feel as if they have the smashed arm and generates the idea of the movement being really lackluster and slow. Personification is when you give animals, inanimate objects, or abstract feelings human qualities. This is often used to make the readers feel a closer connection to these objects. We can see this in Cal Ruman's The Emigre, where she writes, "I comb its hair and love its shining eyes." In this quote, Rumans is referring to the speaker's city, and is giving it human qualities to express the love she has for it, which she has to abandon in the context of the poem. Presenting the city as if it were an actual person makes the reader feel as if the speaker has to leave a loved one behind in the face of a war, when in reality they're only leaving their home, which still has a similar effect as if they are leaving an actual person behind. There is also a technique called zoomorphism, which is giving a person animalistic traits. Now, just a quick heads up, this poem I'll be using as an example for this next technique will contain graphic descriptions. However, it is included in the One Conflict Poetry Guide for GCSEs, so you will have to read it anyway if you are doing your GCSEs. But just a warning. Now, let's talk about hyperboles. Yes, the one we all thought was pronounced hyperbole. A hyperbole is when you exaggerate something to implicate the emotion that's being used for the context. For example, in Wilfred Owen's war poem, Dulce et decorum es, he exaggerates the effects of poisonous gas on a soldier by describing his own blood as gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, while the soldier is in fact gargling on his own blood. The verb exaggerates the physical and emotional effects on the soldier, as well as the speaker and the reader, forcing them to picture this gruesome image in their head. Now, imagery is quite straightforward. It's when a writer describes a setting to appeal or trigger the reader's senses. This can be found in another of Wilfred Owen's poems, called Exposure, where it says, "Our brains ache in the merciless ice winds that knife us," which invokes the deadly atmosphere of the weather conditions during the war, and how it is capable of inducing as much damage as the soldiers' weapons did. This phrase makes the reader imagine the intense frigidness and strength of the winds that soldiers had to endure during the trenches. When you think of poetry, you usually think that most of them do actually rhyme or have to rhyme, but this isn't the case for every poem. Either the rhyme schemes can differ, or they can casually break, or not even be included at all to emphasize the meaning behind certain poems. In the poem Remains by Ian Armitage, there isn't a consistent rhyme scheme, making the poem seem more like a speech, reflecting Armitage's intentions. This is called a free verse. On the other hand, In Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Tennyson, the poem uses an AA-BCCB rhyme scheme, like a song or a chant. This is to reflect the disciplined heroism of the soldiers in the Crimean War, while also indicating the inevitability of their demise. Iambic pentameter is a metrical pattern which consists of 5 iambs, which are pairs of syllables which follow an unstressed and stressed syllable to mimic a heartbeat. In William Wordsworth's extract from the prelude, the poem follows an iambic pentameter, describing the speaker's approach to a huge mountain range, conveying his determination and courage. One summer evening, led by her, I found. The iambic pentameter mirrors his current emotional state of being composed. However, when the speaker begins to feel the intimidation of the mountains, the iambic pentameter breaks, showing his growing uncertainty. In the line, "With trembling hands, I grasp the weather-stained," the broken rhythm implies the emotional shift, showing the heart beating faster in the face of fear. Juxtaposition is when writers include 2 opposite concepts in the same sentence to highlight the contrasts and deepen the meaning. This is often used to highlight the positives and the negatives of the context being used in that line. This is seen in John Agard's poem Checking Out Me History in the line, "Healing star among the wounded." The contrast of healing and wounded portrays the symbolism of hope and suffering amid a time of racial suppression. In this context, the healing star represents Mary Seacole, a Black British nurse who was celebrated for her medical work during the Crimean War. Agard uses Seacole's story in Checking Out Me History to highlight that she isn't recognised as equally as Florence Nightingale, a white British nurse, despite making equally significant contributions, thus mirroring the poem's theme about Black history being marginalised. Irony is the same in poetry as it is in real-life conversations. It's when something occurs which differs to what you actually expect to happen. Imagine a fearless hero cowering in fear, which is ironic, right? They're supposed to be fearless. In the poem My Last Duchess by Robert Browning, the Duke proudly flaunts his power status and wealth to the reader, and yet absurdly exposes his insecurities. This is seen in the quote, as if she ranked my gift of a 900-year-old name with anybody's gift. Despite his arrogance, the Duke is envious that his significantly younger wife, and when I mean significantly younger, I mean younger than me, engages in a conversation with a man closer to her age. And honestly, I don't blame her, especially if you're a teenager and your husband is a middle-aged control freak. The fact that her minor interactions with this man make this egotistical figure feel threatened is ironic, isn't it? Poets like to hide intended messages of their poem by covering them up with words or objects. This technique is called symbolism. Symbolism can be found in the most unexpected of places in poetry. For example, Poppies by Jane Weir is rich in biblical references that express the speaker's emotions about the loss of her son during the war. Even the title Poppies symbolizes remembrance, like the ones given on November the 11th when the red poppies are being handed out in honor of the soldiers who fought in the war. However, this isn't the only use of symbolism in poppies. The phrase gelled blackthorns refers to the crown of thorns that Jesus, peace be upon him, had to wear in the Bible. In this instance, the speaker uses the connotations of thorns to represent both her physical and emotional pain when touching her deceased son's hair, as if her hands were brushing against thorns. It could also symbolize how the son died a noble death, just like the sacrifice in the Bible. Now, you should know what repetition is. It's when something is repeated again and again and again and again, just like that. This technique is often used to exaggerate a scene in poetry or to emphasize how strongly a speaker feels about something that's being repeated. Linking back to Exposure by Wilfred Owen, the phrase, "but nothing happens," is repeated at the end of each stanza. Initially, you'd be bored by the lack of action. However, this shifts once the repetition stops. This signals a sudden change to draw your attention to how pointless the war is. The use of repetition indicates the soldiers aimlessly waiting for an attack that never arrives, and instead they succumb to the harsh weather conditions rather than enemy fire. And that wraps up everything you need to know about techniques and structures when studying poetry. And as you can see, there is a lot. So many, in fact, that this isn't even all of them. Poetry and literature in general consist of a vast number of techniques which can help make writing so much more interesting. I could go on and cover all of them, but we'd be here forever, and I know you guys don't want to sit here for ages listening to me yap about poetry all day. So, see you soon and stay tuned for the Stanza study.